I'm glad you're here. Today, we are coming together to celebrate the FEL Priestley Memorial Lectures in the History of Ideas here at the Paul Cadario Conference Center. My name is Sally Tagliamonte, and I am the acting principal of University College. I'm also a professor of linguistics and a Canada Research Chair in language variation and change. We are going to have a series of 3 lectures over the next 3 days. Tonight's title is The Limits of Cosmopolitanism, the Case of Pietro della Valle. Tomorrow, we'll be hearing Going Dutch, the VOC, that is the United Dutch East Indian Company, and its radar. And on Thursday, we'll be hearing a lecture entitled Between France and the Netherlands, Isaac de Saint-Martin, Philology, and collection. Let us now focus our attention and come together in a good way. This is an auspicious occasion that has us coming together with intellectual curiosity. May we bring an openness to new ideas with a common goal to learn more about intellectual encounters between Europe and Asia in the 17th century. But before we look into that past, I would like to begin with where we are in time and space. In Toronto, in 2025, on this day, I wish to acknowledge the land on which we meet and where the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across North and Central America, a territory called Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live on this land, and I ask that you take a moment to reflect on the Indigenous history that has brought us to where we all are here and now. The FEL Priestley Memorial Lectures in the History of Ideas originate in support provided by a number of Professor Priestley's former students, one of whom is here today. The lectures reflect Professor Priestley's broad interest in the history of ideas and his dedication to teaching and to scholarship. In this regard, we are extremely honored to have Professor Sanjay Subrahmanyam here with us. Professor Subrahmanyam is Distinguished Professor and Irving and Jean Stone Endowed Chair in Social Sciences at the University of California in Los Angeles. He is a specialist in the history of the 15th to 18th centuries with a range in foci from studies of India and the Indian Ocean to early modern empires, including the Dutch, the English, and the French. In our current world climate, Professor Subrahmanyam's reflections on the history of other places in the past may well help us to put our current uncertain times into perspective. Before we introduce Professor Subrahmanyam from a disciplinary perspective, I would like to give you some quick housekeeping notes. If you haven't ever been at one of our Endowed lectures, I now tell you about the rules of this event. For those attending in person, a microphone will be passed around during the Q&A portion of today's lecture. Please raise your hand to ask a question once the lecture concludes. Be sure to enunciate and talk into the microphone so that we can all hear what you say. It's important to speak into the microphone too, because our audience at home, of which there are many, would like to hear your questions as well. For those attending virtually, live closed captioning is available for this event. The option can be turned on by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please use the Zoom chat function to submit your online questions. We will be watching for them and give you a chance to ask your questions. I now call upon Associate Professor Malavika Kasturi to introduce our distinguished speaker from a disciplinary perspective.
Thank you. As a fellow historian, but one who works on the modern period, though I've sort of revised my understanding of that after reading Sanjay's the article that we're going to discuss on periodization, It's very hard actually to do justice to the breadth and vision of his work, his research, and also the full range of his achievements. So I'm not going to try and do that here. Instead, I'm just going to talk very, very briefly because I think you're all here to listen to someone else and not me. That that Sanjay's contribution has not just been to South Asian history. In fact, he's redefined how we think about space, South Asia, and in fact has questioned the sort of the neat separation of regions, the efforts by historians to move beyond national histories, but yet to stay within them. Through the questions he's asked, through the research he has done, in very wide-ranging work between the between the period that many historians call early modern, but I'm going to sort of use, sort of chronologically from the 15th to the 18th centuries very, very broadly. He has written and published very widely on histories of colonialism, the Indian Ocean, language, philology, political economy, and the idea of connected and global histories. His work that moves and questions the kind of periodizations which has often constrained historians from asking questions that stop, especially in South Asian history in the 18th century, and which has also very often moved the ways in which the discipline in India has moved. Where I come from, Jawaharlal Nehru University, where people who were trained in masters and MPhils in modern Indian history didn't actually engage much with those who worked on what was called medieval and ancient history. I think much to our detriment. And I think those are many of the questions that as I teach and research, though my own work is on the sort of 20th and 21st centuries, quote unquote, I do think and reflect upon the way I need to revise and rethink my teaching as well as my research. But my own engagement with Sanjay has been as that of a reader and as somebody who has used his work also to think about my own very limited engagement with archives and methodology. And I've come here today also to listen as well as to learn. So his research, that needs no introduction at all, moves effortlessly across various languages and archives to write histories about and beyond South Asia in ways that speak to historians and scholars across fields, regions, and disciplines through both his methodology as well as the broader questions he asks. I will not again rehearse his publications, which are again prodigious. He has published many books and articles, the most recent being Across the Green Sea, Histories from the Western Indian Ocean, University of Texas Press, 2024, Empires Between Islam and Christianity, Permanent Black and Sunni Press in 2018, and Europe's India, Words, Peoples, Empires, 1500 to 1800, which gives you just a little insight about the depth and the scale of his work. So in a sense, his work speaks directly to the idea to Priestley Lectures, and as you've already heard, is on the theme Philology, Botany, and Religion, Euro-Asian Intellectual Encounters in the 17th Century. And today he will be speaking on the theme, The Limits of Cosmopolitanism, in which he examines the writing of Pietro della Valle and his exploration of philology, science, geography, and religion. So it was a great delight. I invite Professor Subrahmanyam to come and speak to us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malavika. As some of you will realize, I'm only 5 years late. I was supposed to deliver these lectures in 2020, and then you know what happened in the spring of 2020, and so here we are in 2025. I've actually changed the topic of the lectures. You'll be happy to hear that what was supposed to be the lectures of 2020 have since been published. And so this is the new set of materials, and which I hope to share with you, focusing essentially on the 17th century. Now, my purpose here is to triangulate, so address these three different but related fields, related sometimes in unexpected ways: philology, botany, and religion. Sometimes all three of them together, sometimes two of them at a time. And I'm going to do this by addressing some different moments of the 17th century. So this first lecture is actually chronologically the first. It begins in the early part of the 17th century, and the later lectures will move us progressively into the second half of the century. The cast of characters will also vary. So today, we are going to talk about Pietro della Valle and the question of the limits of cosmopolitanism, which is something which is appropriate given the fact that here we are dealing with someone who saw himself and others saw him as a quintessentially cosmopolitan actor. So what are we talking about? We're talking about a involvement in Asia, which for various reasons has not received as much attention as that of certain other European nations and groups. The Italians, unlike the English, the Dutch, the French, even the Danes, actually never formed a organized corporate or other body in order to go into Asia, either as explorers or as traders or as warriors. The Italians approached Asia in the period after 1500 pretty much as they had done in the period before 1500, which is essentially as individuals. And we know, of course, of some of these pre-1500 individuals, most famously Marco Polo, but there are also a number of others like Girolamo de Santo Stefano and so on. Now, after 1500, there is an increase in the presence of Italians in Asian waters and in Asia more generally. And this happens because several Italians, that is to say those most noticeably coming from Florence, but also to a lesser extent Venice, and to a still lesser extent Genoa, actually enter the Indian Ocean through the Portuguese. So they come in as collaborators of the Portuguese, working, therefore, hand in glove sometimes with them, but never actually, as I said, forming themselves into a collective body for this purpose. This is a question which has fascinated a certain kind of Italian historian for a very long time. So here are two rather old books from the late 19th century which actually talk about it. Angelo de Governatis, very well-known, well, at least amongst the cognoscenti, book called Storia dei Viaggiatori Italiani, and the other book by Amati Sanfilippo, which also talks about the illustrious Italian travelers and lists a number of these people who arrived in Asia in the 16th and the early 17th century. Now, when they're talking about such travelers, this person holds a place of considerable importance. And this is Pietro della Valle, described here in the English translation of his work as a noble Roman. And we can see that this work was published actually in the 1660s in Italian, almost immediately translated into English. This is the English edition that you see of 1665. On the right-hand side, you see the frontispiece of the German translation, which is also from roughly the same period. In fact, it was a work which had considerable success across the European, Western European sphere, certainly, in translation after translation. So he's someone who, in spite of the fact that he came to Asia more than a century after the Portuguese had begun to explore the Western Indian Ocean, and was therefore a relatively late arrival in terms of writing his account, nevertheless had a considerable success in terms of this very account. So this is the original Italian version, okay? And if you look at the title page of both of these versions, you will see that in both of these, Pietro della Valle, of course, features, but there is also somebody else who features. And that is actually the person who put this work out. And that was not Pietro della Valle himself, but somebody whom you will see over there. Let me see if that actually works. So it's actually someone called Mario Schipano that you can see on the somewhere in the middle of the left-hand side page and somewhere towards the top on the right-hand side page. And it says that travels were described by himself in familiar letters to his erudite friend, al erudito suo amico, Mario Schipano. And it was actually, therefore, Mario Schipano who was responsible for putting this work out. And we'll come back to some of the implications of this. He's by no means the only so-called traveler author who was helped by somebody else. And sometimes that help can be more than just help. Sometimes we actually know that some of these accounts were completely transformed in the process of passing from the author to the publisher, that intermediate stage. So who then is this man? And let's have a very quick look at his biography. Okay, so he was born in 1586 to Giovanna Alberini and Pompeo della Valle. The family claimed to be descended from medieval aristocrats, though genealogists have disputed this. He spent a part of his 20s in Naples, which is where he met Schipano. And at that time, he was involved in various expeditions against so-called pirates and corsairs, particularly those in North Africa. This is also a phase when he apparently had a rather turbulent love life, and it may have been this which explained, according to at least some authors of the period, the fact that he decided in 1614 to begin his travels. Apparently, he had written a brief autobiographical text about this early part of his life, which is the text that you see there, account of what Pietro della Valle did before leaving for the Orient. But this text is now lost. So in fact, we don't actually know what it contains. Now, he left then for the Orient, which is to say the Eastern Mediterranean, in June of 1614, departing from Venice, arriving in Istanbul. He then proceeded to travel in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the Aegean, in Egypt, in Sinai, and in Jerusalem. He then subsequently moved further east still, traveling from the Ottoman territories to those of the Safavids. And so he traveled to Baghdad via Damascus and Aleppo in 1616. At this point, an important event happens in his life, which is he decides to get married to a woman who belongs to the Assyrian Christian community. And this is a woman who goes by the name of Sittimani. In his version, her name is written as Geoerida, but modern authors have suspected that, in fact, it's a distortion of the term Juvairi. With his wife, and by the way, always accompanied by a very substantial entourage, because this is someone who really travels in posh style, he eventually arrives in Isfahan, which is the capital of the ruler of Iran, the Safavid ruler of Iran at this time, 1617. And he then joins the entourage of that ruler, Shah Abbas, the very significant fourth or fifth, depending on how you count it, ruler of that dynasty, and is actually with him for roughly 4 years. And in fact, apparently in this process, gains, at least according to him, some degree of intimacy with the monarch. Subsequently, he travels to the southern part of Iran. He travels to Laristan. He is in the cities of Shiraz, of Lar, and so on. While he's there, his wife, Sittimani, dies in childbirth in 1621, December. Now, Pietro della Valle, however, does not stop his travels. He proceeds to travel then from the Persian Gulf on an English East India Company ship to Surat, to Goa, and then to Kannada, to coastal Karnataka in 1622 to 23, returns eventually to Muscat in November 24, from there to Naples in February 26. He then returns eventually to Rome, where he marries the very young adopted Georgian daughter of his deceased wife, Mariam Tinatin Ziba, much against the wishes of his own family, has a large number of children with her thereafter, and eventually dies in Rome in February 1652. There is something which I should point out to you, which is a rather curious fact, which is also that after his wife dies, he insists that he will travel with her body, because he wants to take her body back for it to be buried in his family mausoleum in Rome. So in fact, he has a special coffin constructed in order to travel with this body, which he takes then to India and brings back all the way from India back to Muscat, back through the desert, and eventually to the Eastern Mediterranean, and from there to Naples, right? So this is a rather curious proceeding, and there has been a certain amount of discussion as to what exactly was the cultural referent which he was using for this purpose. Now, Pietro della Valle, okay, this is those frontispiece portraits you've seen of him are rather fanciful. This is actually a portrait which was made during his lifetime by a reasonably well-known artist, a sketch. Was someone who was then very well connected, who was very well known during his lifetime. But this other thing which I will point out to you is that he dies in 1652. But the account only comes out in the 1660s. So in fact, he was not alive when the account came out. So there too, you have to bear in mind the importance of the intervention of Schipano, which I will come back to, the nature of that intervention in order to bring that text to the attention of the public. Now, what was the tradition then within which Pietro della Valle was functioning, if any? So there was one tradition, which was of Italian traders. And these Italian traders had sometimes participated in the spice trade, in the pepper trade. As I said, they had sometimes worked for the Portuguese as traders. The most famous such person is the Florentine Filippo Sassetti, who was in Cochin and Goa in the 1580s and so on. But that was not the tradition in which Pietro della Valle was working. He was working in a different tradition. And that was the tradition of people who were traveling as intellectual travelers. Right? And if one actually goes back to who the origins of that tradition were, perhaps we can date it even into the first half of the 16th century. But I believe that these are the crucial characters. These two brothers called Vecchietti, Giambattista and Girolamo, who were in fact from the same kind of milieu. They were relatively upper class people. And in fact, the interesting thing about them was that they went out in the 1580s to Asia with a rather curious purpose. And that purpose was that they were actually sent to collect manuscripts. Right? And these manuscripts that they were collected on behalf of the papacy, which was curious to actually find manuscripts referent above all to Eastern Christianity. And notably, they wanted to know whether there were biblical traditions which were available in Eastern languages, which could be collected and brought back so that they could be preserved in the Vatican Library. So this is the Vecchiettis, and we know that Pietro della Valle actually had direct contact with the Vecchiettis in his youth before he went out. So this is more the kind of tradition within which he's locating himself. So here we have then the visual representation of his travels. You can see crossing the Eastern Mediterranean through Iraq and Iran, the Persian Gulf, and eventually making it to the west coast of India, and then back again by the same route. You will note that he does not choose either on the way out or on the way back to use the Portuguese route. That is, he does not want to take the Cape of Good Hope as his main link between Western Europe and South Asia. Now, there's been a certain amount of attention devoted to Pietro della Valle ever since the time of the publication of his text, but not much, actually, interestingly enough, in the last, let's say, half century or so. This is the last, I think, important piece on him that was published by my former colleague in Oxford, John Gurney, the historian of Iran. Now, John Gurney in this article made several very important points, which I will be building on over here. One is that he suggests that there is a difference between Pietro della Valle and the typical European traveler to Iran in this period, who are people like Jean Chardin, Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, Adam Oliarius, and so on. So these are people who are typically either traders, and typically actually very often jewel traders, or they are people who have a semi-diplomatic, semi-trading function. right? So this is a point that Gurney makes, which is this is a very different sort of profile than the profile that Pietro della Valle has. So here is what Gurney tells us. In some respects, Pietro della Valle stands out from the general category of European travelers of this period as an exception. Born into an aristocratic Roman family, he traveled for no other reason other than the dictates of his own curiosity and interest. And at no stage in the 12 years of his absence for Italy did he show the slightest concern about his financial support. As a patrician, independent of any kind of constraint, he described the inspiration of his travels simply as glory. And then he says he regarded himself as a man of action and that he had fought against the corsairs and so on and so forth. But it's also interesting, as he points out, that for whatever curious reason, which might have been his choice or Schipano's choice, he's also presented in the text as il pellegrino, as the pilgrim. So what is he a pilgrim to is an interesting question. So this is then where matters stand in terms of the interpretative framework. But at the same time, the curious thing is there's an accumulation of very small and extremely precise articles regarding Pietro della Valle, which have, on the other hand, emerged in the last 50 years. Articles and even larger works than that, which are essentially because of the fact that people have realized, as opposed to an earlier scholarship which depended essentially on his travels, that there is an enormous body of materials, archivistic materials regarding him that actually exists. Okay. So here is an example, an article which deals with a manuscript which has been found, again, in the Vatican Library, which concerns verses in Turkish and other languages that he wrote, right? And this actually suggests that, therefore, as opposed to many other travelers who would often claim a very advanced knowledge of various languages and traditions and so on, he did actually seem to have possessed a reasonable knowledge of at least 3 languages, which is to say Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, to which I will return, and Persian. So he actually was in a position, right, to actually even write not very good verse, but passable verse, let's say, in Turkish, and he was able to similarly to actually write in both Arabic and in Persian. So we know this now from the kinds of materials that have been put out concerning him. There's also now more and more evidence that besides these kinds of literary works that he put out, and he also incidentally made it a point sometimes to copy verses of other poets. Sometimes he copied verses which he found on gravestones. So besides these, we can also see that he was particularly interested in geography, and I'll come back in a minute to the geographical works that he produced. So we are now in a position where we are starting to get a picture of Pietro della Valle, where we are able to step away a little bit from his own self-presentation to this other set of materials, which we can use to, in a way, read against and sometimes with that self-presentation. But frequently, there are some interesting tensions that arise between the other materials and these. So we know, for example, that Pietro della Valle claimed great proximity to this ruler that you see over here, Shah Abbas of Iran. Shah Abbas was a rather strange and intriguing character, right, who not only was very important in the military history, but also for various reforms, administrative and others, that he carried out, for the fact that he had a very active trade policy with regard especially to Iranian silk. But it is actually interesting to compare the writings of Pietro della Valle to the fact that we have a number of other people who are present in Shah Abbas's court at much the same time. So this is the Spanish ambassador, Don Garcia de Silva y Figueroa, who actually wrote an account of his time, which overlapped with Pietro della Valle's time at the court. And it's interesting to see the extent to which these two accounts actually converge and diverge. Because on the one hand, if you read Garcia de Silva y Figueroa, he talks about how he's constantly mistreated in the Safavid court, how he is dealt with utter contempt and so on. On the other hand, Pietro della Valle's Shah Abbas is a very different figure. He's a sort of a ludic figure. He's very playful. He pokes ambassadors in the tummy and makes jokes with them, and so on and so forth. So you get a very sort of different feeling for what the nature of such contacts is, and also, in a sense, for what the possibilities of, shall we say, conversations across cultures are. And he's giving us a sense that if you are a true cosmopolitan in the sense that he is, well, then you can actually penetrate some of these barriers, which, let's say, a Spanish hidalgo might not be in a position to do. Okay, now a large part of the time that he spent, beyond that which he spent in the court, was spent in the southern part of Iran, in the province of Fars. And in particular, we know that Pietro della Valle spent a good deal of time in the city of Lar, which is actually something which is worth noting, because Lar is one of those forgotten urban centers in Iran from the 16th and 17th centuries. It's extremely important from various points of view. It actually is the source of the most important silver currency in the Indian Ocean in the 15th and 16th century, the lari. But it is also a place where, as it turns out, you had a very lively intellectual culture, which was not that of the court. It was a distinct intellectual culture that we are dealing with. Now, Pietro della Valle spent time there, and it was really in the vicinity of Lar that his wife, whom you see depicted here, died, as I've mentioned to you, in childbirth. But in spite of the fact that that this event happened there, he remained for some time, even beyond her death, which was partly by choice and partly because there were events that were going on at this time which made him a bit reluctant to move, which is that at this time there was a contest going on between the Iranians, the Portuguese, and the English for the control of the southern part of the province. Right now, this incidentally, just by way of should we say aside, is the document that he put out at the moment when he had brought the wife's body to Rome, and he had her installed in the family mausoleum. And this is the ceremony, and this is the kind of frieze that he had put up on the tomb. And he actually got many of his poet friends to write funerary poetry on this occasion to be deposited in this tomb, which of course is all the more odd given the fact that at roughly the same time he was also organizing his own marriage with his stepdaughter, and then so on and so forth. So now the question, of course, which arises is how was he functioning? How was he actually managing to do what he was able to do through this whole period? Was he actually someone who was just surrounded with this entourage of people and was therefore able to move from one place to another without the slightest of difficulties? Or did he actually have a sort of network of people that he was drawing upon? It turns out that if we begin to explore his materials, there was actually a very sizable network of very diverse people that he was constantly drawing upon. This is one of the most visible of those people. And even this man is not particularly visible. George Strachan was a Scottish Jesuit who decided to travel to Iran at the beginning of the 17th century. And Strachan was interested in learning Turkish and Persian, and eventually died before he could return to Europe. But Strachan is actually known today because he collected a small but quite valuable set of Persian texts, which are today deposited in the Vatican Library. And we actually do have enough of Strachan to realize that Strachan, because he was, as a Jesuit, fairly well integrated with various milieu in Isfahan and elsewhere in Iran, he was in fact someone who had a much deeper, shall we say, local rooting than Pietro della Valle did. And so he was able to actually use Strachan's networks for his own purposes. Now, it's actually on this basis that he eventually is able to not only put out that travel text or autobiography or some combination of the two, but various other works that della Valle will actually put out. So he actually put out a Latin geography of Safavid Iran, which has been discussed, and where the most recent treatment of it by Sonja Brenches and Volkmar Schüller actually tells us that effectively it is not a very original work. It's actually essentially derivative. It draws on existing geographies and so on, but still it is interesting that he is someone who wishes to show his erudition to the point also of demonstrating the fact that he controls not merely the contemporary geography of Iran and the Persian Gulf, but even its ancient geography. Okay. Now, there were other texts that he wrote which were more original than the geography. So this is one of them. This is a text that he wrote, which is termed Risale, a treatise. And this text is again in the Vatican Library in 2 manuscripts. Right? So that's one of the manuscripts from the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana. Now, this is a very strange text because here is Pietro della Valle writing this text while resident probably in Lar, but certainly while living in the southern part of Iran. And what is this text? It is basically an extremely violent anti-Muslim polemic. Right? So he's sitting in Iran in around 1620, and he basically writes a text which is to demonstrate the falsehood of Islam and even more so Shiite Islam, which of course is what would prick the Iranians at this time harder than any critique of Sunni Islam. It's interesting that what it also suggests is that he was reading. He was reading other polemics, right? And if we actually follow the literature on this, this is Alberto Tiburcio's recent book on Muslim-Christian polemics in Safavid Iran. We know that there was a chain of polemics which had happened somewhat as follows. In the Mughal court, in around 1600, a Jesuit by the name of Geronimo Xavier had written with some collaborators a translation of certain Christian texts, including a life of Jesus and the life of St. Peter and so on and so forth. So he had put these into Persian. Indian Persian intellectual in the Mughal court had written a response to these. Subsequently, somebody in Iran had also written a response to this. So this original text was called Mirat al-Quds, and these people made jokes about this term Mirat, which means mirror. So their texts would have titles such as the one who has polished the mirror, or the mirror that needed polishing, and so on and so forth. So they wrote all these responses, which were essentially making fun of Christianity. And they are based on fairly normal polemics or normal polemical devices, such as the idea that Christians don't have a revealed text, that in fact what they claim is their holy book is a kind of distorted history book, whereas of course the Quran is a revealed text. So they're making this distinction, making fun of various incidents, such as, for example, the famous Noli Me Tangere incident, right, in which Christ, after the resurrection, appears to Mary Magdalene, and making fun of that, and so on. So we know all these devices, but what Pietro della Valle does is he inserts himself into this series of polemics and writes this text. But not only does he write this text, he does something which is even more extraordinary. He actually leaves manuscripts of his text in Lar, in various public places, asking people to read it and to comment on it. Right? So he's not merely interested in actually having a polemic with the Muslim intellectuals of the time, but he's actually interested in having a public polemic with them at this time. But very, very curious then, which is, so this is not the shall we say, dispassionate, distant, let's say, geographer making maps of the Caspian Sea or Iran. This is someone who is actually, shall we say, getting his hands dirty in certain kinds of extremely polemical dealings. Okay. Now, but is that all we can make of him then? Was he basically there, shall we say, to stir the pot in sitting in Lar at this time? No, he's more complicated than that. He also is doing other things which are rather curious and which make of him really this figure whose bits and pieces are quite difficult sometimes to reconcile with one another. Now, I mentioned to you that in 1621-22, right after the death of his wife, he is stuck actually in Lar because he wants to go to India, but something is going on at this time. And what is going on is that this island that you see over here, which is the island of Jarun or Hormuz, is being contested between the English and Shah Abbas on the one side and the Portuguese on the other side. So the Portuguese are the ones who are in this island, and the English and Shah Abbas are attacking it. Eventually, the English and Shah Abbas will succeed. The Portuguese will be expelled from this island, okay? And the island will no longer be used thereafter, but they will create a port on the mainland called Bandar Abbas, which will become the great Iranian port through the rest of the 17th century, right? So this is what is happening. And in a way, Pietro della Valle is twiddling his thumbs and waiting for this to all take place before he can get on his English company ship and go to Western India. So what does he do while he is doing this? So he writes polemical texts against Islam. Okay, that's one thing that he does. But he doesn't content himself by doing that. He starts collecting texts, right? And so he actually, in this time in Lar, we know is his most productive moment as a collector of Persian texts, right? And these texts are of varied types. So here is, for example, a text that he collects, which is, as you can see, BAV is the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana. And this is one of the texts that he collects is called Jangnama-e-Keshm. And it is a text in what is called the Masnavi form, which is like a rhymed epic. And it concerns the war between the Safavids and the Portuguese over a neighboring island of Hormuz called Keshm. So this is a text which is written by somebody by the name of Qadri Shirazi, and he actually collects this. He also collects another text, which for reasons that I've not entirely been able to sort out, has wound up by some complicated route today in the British Library. Okay? And this is a parallel text to this, which is called Jarun Nama. This one is actually illustrated. And it shows, again, the fight over Jarun, which is to say Hormuz. And again, it's in the same Masnavi form. It's these long verses about this. So curiously, he's collecting these texts, some of which are in fact useful, if you want, for people who want to see the Portuguese-Iranian conflict from the Iranian perspective, right? If that's what you wanted to understand, because the Portuguese, of course, are putting out their own version of this conflict. But here he is giving you a different version of the conflict. Besides this, he buys a whole lot of other texts in Lar. And we can see this because these texts, many of them are now deposited in the Vatican Library, and you can see the colophons show you that these are scribes from Lar who have been copying these texts. Sometimes they are much older texts, right? But they have been copied in typically the early 17th century in Lar, and he's buying this. So here, he's continuing the tradition of the Vecchietti, and he's continuing this process of essentially building a base for whoever wishes to consult the Vatican Library to actually have a set of Persian manuscripts at their disposal. Here is another illustration. You can see these are not terribly high quality paintings. This is not, a Safavid courtly painting by any stretch of the imagination, but interesting enough that he was able to lay his hands on it. Now, subsequently, he moves to India, and he will then be in Surat. And then from Surat, he moves to Goa. And when he goes to Goa, we know that he engages in still another activity, which is a still different activity from those that he has been dealing with so far, which is he encounters a Jesuit in Goa, and the Jesuit and he decide that it is actually necessary to spread the so-called Tychonic system, the system of Tycho Brahe, and make it known in the Eastern world, right? Because they are afraid that people otherwise in the East will be seduced by the other new tendencies in Western astronomy. So between the two of them, they concoct this idea that what they will do is they will produce a Persian translation of a text in Latin, which Borus makes available to Pietro della Valle. And the two of them are sitting, therefore, in a monastery in Goa, sometime in early 1623, producing this text. Right? On the left, the Latin version, on the right, the Persian version. And the purpose of this text is that it will then be, it's supposed to be carried back by somebody, presumably one of his English intermediaries, because the Portuguese will have difficulty by this time getting back into Iran. And it's supposed to be given to someone who is a friend of his called Zainuddin Lari, therefore somebody also from Lar. Now, presumably the text which went to Zainuddin Lari must have gone off somewhere into Iran, and this is the copy that remained with Pietro della Valle, which he would eventually carry back with him and deposit in the Vatican library as well. So as my American friends would say, he's as busy as a one-armed paper hanger, isn't he? I mean, he's doing geographical texts. He's doing translations of texts on astronomy. He's writing religious polemics. All of this at the same time, buying and collecting manuscripts. All of this is essentially happening. Now, I want to come back to the letters and come back to the basic text, right, by which he came to be known. And the problem of that text itself, and especially the fact that that text was manipulated by Schipano. Now, again, when I say manipulated, I don't mean to say that it was necessarily against his will, because 12 years elapsed between Pietro della Valle's death and the actual publication of this text. But until recently, we did not actually know what Schipano had done. Right? But it's only recently that, fortunately, still in the Vatican Library, we actually found the original manuscript of the letters. And so now it is possible, which are, by the way, in this horrible hand, but it is now possible, and people have slowly begun this work of doing a comparison. So here, for example, right, on the left is the original diary entry. On the right is what is retained in the letters. Right? Now, you can see that some of the things which have been done are for obvious practical reasons, which is wherever he writes in Persian in the diary, he has not wished to actually retain that, because it would presumably also meant the expense of actually having a Persian typeset into the text. And presumably, I'm not entirely sure that Schipano, his Persian was actually up to it. So that has been deleted. But then you can also see that there are passages where certain things are taken out, and there are passages which entirely disappear. Right? The middle passage, which you can see over here, for example, Manka is gone. So you can see that there's been a certain amount of fairly serious editing, et cetera, et cetera. Things have been removed, things have been manipulated, and it remains to this day for us to actually be able to give a total picture of what the difference is between the two, because we don't, as of now, actually have a published version of this. What we do have is the necessity of going back each time to the manuscripts and trying to make the comparison between the two. But this is actually a very, very interesting and rare instance, because with a number of other travelers, for instance, Tavernier, we know that Tavernier's text was completely manipulated by somebody else. But we don't have what Tavernier originally wrote. We only have the other text, right? So it's an interesting point to actually have this opportunity to eventually make this comparison. What we do have, and the handwriting is no better, right, is a subsequent diary that he wrote after coming back to Italy. Okay, and that actually has been published recently by the Accademia dei Lincei in 2019. And here he gives us a sense of his networks in Italy after he came back, how he tried to persuade people to be interested in what he had seen, what he had done, and how he was able actually to therefore push his materials and bring them to the notice of the public. So this, for example, has allowed a few quite interesting insights to emerge. So, for example, the historian in the University of Bologna, Chiara Petrolini, has recently written a very interesting essay, which you see over here, about the correspondence between Pietro della Valle and Sebastian Tengnagel. Now, Tengnagel is a very important personage because he was the librarian of the Habsburg Library in Vienna. Right? And so the two of them were actually exchanging letters. Della Valle was actually providing Tengnagel with an understanding of both Ottoman politics and of the situation in Iran at this time. And Tengnagel was giving him whatever he could. So it was a very unequal exchange, but Tengnagel did have some kind of espionage-related materials and occasionally translations from Ottoman Turkish into Latin that had been done for the consumption of the Habsburg. So you can actually see how this kind of exchange works. But there were actually surely a large number of other people with whom he was maintaining this thing. A last little point which I want to make to you before just looking finally at his networks. Interestingly, a Russian scholar has turned up a whole bunch of letters written to Pietro della Valle in Arabic, and which are in St. Petersburg, right? And these letters are actually family letters. So these are the letters which his in-laws wrote to him. And so there you have them. Okay. And so here's an example. Okay, so this is written in the city of Rome, okay, from somebody called Johanna, who is a member of his wife's family. So the letter runs like this. First of all, it's interesting to note that they always address Pietro della Valle as Begzadeh, referring to the fact that he's of noble birth. Which is normally the translation of something like gentiluomo. So in the name of God, to he is of noble birth and is known by the name of Begzadeh, salutations, again salutations and salutations, and so on. Now, remember that the in-laws are also Christian, though they're not of the same denomination. So I ask God, the omniscient Lord, to multiply the love between us until the day of judgment. Then also he sends salutations from other members of the family, Khaja Habib Jan, the brother Abdullah Beg, interesting, the Christian, but with the name Abdullah Beg. The other members of the family and so on. You'll see a verse is quoted in the middle. I write a letter and the tears flow and the pain of separation is making the heart ill. Now, it's interesting that the letter has notations from Pietro della Valle at the bottom about when he received them and so on. So he received them when the wife was still alive. So you can actually see that he was capable of actually maintaining or at least reading letters that were being sent to him within a familial context in Arabic. So this again gives you a sense of not only his capacity to work with these languages, but actually use them, as I said, in a private context and so on. This is again, these are matter of curiosity, but they're quite interesting as little pieces of evidence of his insertion into various kinds of domestic networks and so on. Now, of course, he eventually makes his way to South India. I will not discuss that part of his sojourn because we actually don't have a lot beyond what he tells us. What he tells us is in part rather doubtful. He goes to this part of India, the Karnataka, and he claims that when he was there, he had various encounters with people. The most improbable is a long conversation which he claims he had with a woman who was about to ride to become a sati, right? So she was on this horse and she was going to go and immolate herself on the pyre of her husband who had died. But Pietro della Valle claimed that while she was on the way, she stopped and had a long chat with him. He claims that he chatted with her in Telugu, which seems a bit improbable given the location, but he gives us a long, verbatim, extremely poetic description of what she said and what she did not say on this moment in her life. He actually then even writes a poem in her honor at the end of this dialogue and so on. So this has been dealt with by a number of specialists of travel literature, but I just want to say again that there is contextual material from this period which can be used to check against his accounts of Mangalore which you see over here, where he gives us his version of visiting and who he saw and who he did not see, his dealings with the Nayaks of Ikkeri, and so on. Okay, so to conclude, here's an overall picture of the kinds of people with whom he dealt and who were actually his network through which he eventually functioned. Here was somebody who was very well connected. He was very well connected, certainly, in Italy with people like Schipano, the Vecchietti brothers, but also very famously Tommaso Campanella, who was someone with whom he had personal relations. So this makes it clear why someone like him would have attracted attention when a text by him was put out. But it's also very interesting to see that there are lots of other people that he's dealing with all along the way. Very eclectic set of people, from Strachan, the Scottish Jesuit, Tengnagel, the Habsburg librarian. But there are also this Achille Darley, who is the French ambassador in Istanbul, with whom he has dealings. These are the people through whom he's collecting, through whom he is actually able to pick up materials. Okay, and you can see that these are also people who give him a sense of familiarity, even as he is venturing into worlds which are not quite a European world. Now, this is, of course, inevitable. And if you look to something like Peter Miller's recent book on Nicolas Fabry de Perez, roughly a contemporary, Miller also gives you a sense that every European intellectual of this time did have these networks. And without these networks, it was actually absolutely impossible for them to function. So the heroic individual is simply a myth. There are never heroic individuals who get anything done. There are always people in networks who get things done. But what is actually interesting, on the other hand, is if we start putting the other side of it together, we can slowly start getting a sense of who his networks, for example, were in Lar and Iran. The people for whom he wrote stuff. The people who must have been the repositories for those anti-Muslim polemics that he wrote. The people who must have helped him also to read texts. So these are people like Mullah Jalaluddin Yazdi, Mullah Masih, Zainuddin Lari, the astronomer that I've mentioned, also other people who like a certain Mullah Abdi that he refers to. So he's also someone who actually has this network, which is both a network through which you procure texts, a network through which you engage in polemics, and a network through which you engage in various forms of translation, sometimes polemical and sometimes not. So overall then, we can say that Pietro della Valle is interesting. He is very particular. He certainly is distinct from those other characters that we've seen, such as Chardin, Tavernier, and so on. But actually, we might also say that he is a kind of a chain in another series, which will move us forward and will hopefully move us forward into the second and third in the series of talks. Most famously, a very interesting character, a German by the name of Engelbert Kempfer, who spent time in Iran in the second half of the 17th century, who was a talented draftsman, but not only drew sort of cityscapes like this, but was also a collector who collected various paintings from the Safavids and brought them back, and in fact turned out at the end of the day to be one of the main suppliers for a certain set of materials to none other than Sir Hans Sloane, who, as we know, was the founder of the British Library. Thank you.
Thank you for such an interesting lecture, Professor Subrahmanyam. Now we'd like to invite you and Professor Kasturi to the main sitting nook for our Q&A session, for which we roughly have 20 minutes left.
So thank you. Can you all hear me? Thank you, Professor Subrahmanyam, for that fascinating talk. And now I'd like to invite questions from the audience. And if you could, I think you will, there is someone with a mic. And if you could, and if you could make your questions short and pointed, that would really help because we have only 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay, for an amazing talk. And I actually want to pick up the beat of botany with Camphor. I almost jumped up when you showed us this because I'm familiar with his book on the Japanese plants. And so I did not know what the Persian works. So I'd love to know about actually how that trajectory develops and what were those networks. So I know he was in Isfahan. So presumably that's where the two of them have connected. But how would you kind of characterize those VOC networks? You know, as I know it's a big question, but I'm kind of interested in the way in which, because Camphor had that kind of official network through the VOC, while even though we find that Pietro was not a lone adventurer, as you've pointed out, but he is also operating very much without, because since the Italians did not have that kind of established connection.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to have to save that question for the third lecture because that's where I'm going to develop the whole question of camphor and the Dutch company. But all I'll say for now is this, that remember that, again, part of the issue is that very often people think in terms of very radical separation between, let's say, Catholics and Protestants. Now, the fact of the matter is that the main element of continuity in the Safavid court is in fact maintained by Catholic priests, right? So who run through the 17th century and who are sometimes there for very long periods of time. Now, the most famous of them is a man who goes by the name of Raphael Dumont. And he, in fact, is there right up almost to the end of the 17th century. He finally writes a very important book called L'État de la Perse, or something like that, the state of Persia. But he's the person who's there, and everybody goes to him. And so you can actually imagine that though there is a gap in terms of time between someone like Pietro della Valle and Camphor, which is not huge, but which is there. Nevertheless, they would have known of each other because of the fact that there were people who were institutionally there preserving a certain kind of continuity. But so far as the Dutch company is concerned, we'll have to save that for day after tomorrow. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Bringing the great visuals. You mentioned during the last part of your presentation that the protagonist actually fabricated a lot of fairy tales about his alleged travels to India, West Coast. So it makes me think about the other Italian guy, Marco Polo. Did he actually visit China and stayed there? Because people dispute, because he did not mention in his travels about the Great Wall nor the tea in China.
Yeah, well, you know that that's it's a long-standing controversy, and there was a book written by somebody from the British Library, I think Francis Wood, about 20 years ago, which was exactly the title of it was "Did Marco Polo Visit China?" Right? So, and that's precisely the point, that there are all these things which are missing in the text, which you would normally expect him to say something about. Well, here's the difficulty, right? And the difficulty is not an unrelated difficulty, which is that the text was entirely rewritten by somebody else, right? So it was actually rewritten by someone called Rustichello di Pisa. And so again, there, our problem is, unlike Pietro della Valle, where we actually have the possibility, the exercise which has only partially been completed so far, of comparing his the manuscript version of his letters with what eventually is the final product. In the case of Marco Polo, we don't have that possibility. We only have the Division du Monde, or whatever was the version which was put out, right? So we don't actually know what might have been in some original version, which Rustichello then for whatever his reasons were, decided to delete. So that's the problem. So the problem which you could then pose is to ask in these kinds of situations, right? Not the famous philosophical question of what is the author, but a much more concrete question of who is the author, right? In many of these texts, which is, and especially, in the case of Marco Polo, remember the first versions which circulate are already manuscript, but then even the manuscript, there is a problem. And then once we enter the 16th and especially 17th century, the world of print, there are several layers between the author and the final printed version. And who is responsible for what between what the author writes? I mean, sometimes it happens to me too. Sometimes I don't recognize what publishers put out in my name, but that's a different story, right? Right? So you can see that there's all these layers of intervention. These days we call it copy editing or something. Yeah. So there you have it. So with Marco Polo, I would say, I would just want to flag that as a problem of the text itself, right? And the real question for me is the flip side question, which I think is worth asking. People have asked, which is that, okay, sorry, I'm being a bit long-winded, but let me just make a small point to you. Some years ago, somebody put out a text claiming that it was a 14th century text. It is called the City of Light or something. And this person said he had found another Italian traveler to China after Marco Polo from Ancona. And this person put this thing out and said, see, here's this other traveler. Now, it was obviously a fake. But the reason why it was a fake was precisely why Marco Polo is probably not a fake, which is there are things you can find in Marco Polo which you cannot find in any Yuan period text, right? So if the person was just taking what was available, then there are certain things which they would not have said.
Did della Valle hold a view on Galileo's astronomical writings? I mean, did he find them persuasive, unpersuasive? You mentioned that he was engaged in astronomical discussion with certain interlocutors. And what did they make of Galileo's findings?
Yeah, so actually the point is this, that Borrus, the Jesuit, and Pietro della Valle are actually engaged in pushing away Galileo, right? But they want to do it in this way where the difference between doing this and the Muslim-Christian polemic is that there you can explicitly identify the enemy, and then you can polemicize against an identified enemy. Here, the point is to use Tycho Brahe, but not to identify the enemy, right? So what they're anxious is, and this is it's an interesting question about, now let's say about 25, 30 years later, right? So the French physician François Bernier was in India. And he says that when he was in India, he was working for someone, a man, an Iranian called Danishmand Khan. And he said that Danishmand Khan would keep asking him for translations of things that he knew existed. He wanted, for example, a translation into Persian of Descartes' Discours, right? So you can see that there's a certain amount of porosity, and people are aware that certain things exist, even if they don't have direct access to them. So what these people are doing is trying to stop that from happening and making sure that the kinds of materials which are available to people in the Islamic world are only of a certain type and not of another type. Right? So, but the point is that it's not polemic against Galileo. It's sweeping him under the carpet.
Thank you, Professor Subrahmanyam. I know you were saying that the time in India for Della Valle is a little bit harder to track, but I was interested, or maybe perhaps a little surprised, that between his linguistic capabilities and his close ties to the Safavid court, he would not have progressed to any of the like that because of the close connections that we know are there between these courts in terms of the intellectual movements at that time. So could you speak on that?
Yes, actually, you're right that the reasonable thing for him to have done would have been precisely to go where his Iranian connections took him, but he didn't, right? And the reason for it is this. I mean, I didn't set it out perhaps as clearly as I might have, but you see, he has a very ambivalent attitude towards the Portuguese. So on the one hand, right, he's sitting in Lar waiting for the Portuguese to be gotten rid of so that he can take an English ship and go to India. But then once he gets to India, he goes to Goa, and then he installs himself in Goa, including in a monastery, right? And then he actually goes to Karnataka with a Portuguese envoy to the Nayak of Ikeri. And so that's how he actually goes there. So at that point in time, he's actually not going into the interior where Persian might have, his Persian and his Iranian connections would have stood him in good stead, but he's going off in this other direction. And I'm left to wonder whether, there he's not, drawn by the fatal attraction of the topoi, that you cannot go to India without having some dealing with a sati. Everybody has to meet a sati. Everybody has to go to a sati ceremony. This is like from the 16th century has been established. In fact, before that, Niccolo de Conti already has it in the 15th century. So, it's just so inevitable that he has to do it, I think. And of course, he gilds the lily by even having the conversation with her and what she tells him and what he tells her, and yeah. So it's curious that you're right that it's and it's also counterintuitive that you would have thought that that would have been but probably his Portuguese interlocutors in Goa would not have been so keen on him doing that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Subrahmanyam, for a very rich talk. I guess I'm asking this question as a medievalist. I'm interested in how the figure of Pietro della Valle helps us maybe complicate the question of periodization between the medieval and the early modern. I see him as rather very much of a medieval figure in this, both in terms of the networks that you highlighted. So we now have a growing body of scholarship on the kind of the 15th century Mediterranean, or of course earlier as well, but specifically in terms of these connections between early Orientalists, if we might call them that, from Italy and elsewhere, and various actually Christian, Middle Eastern Christian scholars. And I think the Vatican plays a considerable role, right? So you have, of course, the Maronite College in Rome being set up, and so you have Christians from the Middle East actually going and learning, studying in Rome, right? So I see that as kind of setting up these networks that you highlight in a way, right? The beginnings of these. So maybe that goes further back, right? If we kind of push the chronology backward. So that's one way to think about it. But the other one that actually your sort of presentation made me think of is in terms of the intellectual disciplines that he's engaging in almost as a polymath. So precisely your sort of point on philology, botany, religion, right, and all the kinds of texts that he's collecting and dealing with. Is this right? Is this a kind of an earlier kind of mode of studying compared to what would later become a more narrower sort of study of the East? So when we think of the classic Orientalist, as a scholar of the East, rather than the kind of polymathic. And I'm not sure if that's correct. I'm just speculating here, and I'm wondering if you would suggest, right, that this kind of a polymath that Pietro della Valle is precisely something earlier rather than 18th, the sort of the villains of our modern, of course, you know who I'm thinking of, right? Is there a difference, right? How does that change? So in a way, I mean, just the question really is, where does the story of Orientalism fit into the periodization issue, right, between the medieval and the early modern?
Well, that's a lot of questions. So let me try to see what I can do with them, and perhaps we can save some of the conversation for the next 2 days. So it seems to me that I mean, surely we can't believe that 1500 happened and everything changed. I mean, amongst other things, because I mean, let's face the fact that for the very long period that people use the concept of the Renaissance and the term Renaissance, it sits across that divide, right? It sits across that divide from the 14th through to, let's say, at least the 16th century, maybe beyond, right? So to that extent, I mean, the fact that there is a relationship between someone like Pietro della Valle and earlier Italian, traditions of erudition and so on is absolutely logical. It's absolutely unsurprising. Even though institutionally, there are things which have shifted, right? Like, for example, there are these new academies and so on, which are new milieu for sociability amongst different kinds of people compared to the kinds of milieu which might have existed before. So that's one kind of difference. Of course, another kind of difference, which I kept alluding to one way or another, was that he lives finally, and he lives for us also finally, because of the intervention of print. And this is not an insignificant fact, right? And so, in fact, part of our problem is precisely to then ask ourselves, where does print stand in the 17th century in relation to, let's say, the fact that there is still, I don't know what percentage of the iceberg, which is manuscript, which still exists somewhere there below the water, right? So there is that fact also which we need to consider, right? Now, should we see him really then as a continuation of an earlier type? Yes, for sure. But at the same time, I think that what he's doing is somewhat distinct, somewhat different, and it's also located in political geography, of course, which is very particular to that period, including, incidentally, the fact that since the Fatimids, there's never been an important Shiite power since until the Safavids, right? And so Islam, for people in the West, is Sunni Islam for a long period of time, right? And whereas now, incidentally, that brings me to something which I should just briefly mention, which is somebody has claimed, which I find very improbable, that the reason why he carried the wife's body back was because that this could be some kind of reference to a Shiite tradition, which I find extremely improbable, right? I mean, we know that Shiites have a different relation to relics. We know that, for example, Sunnis have very strict rules concerning how long you can keep a body before it has to be buried, right? But it seems to me that this very improbable business of carting this body, from Iran to India to back to Iran and across the desert, and I mean, this is something, if you'll excuse my saying so, somewhat pathological about this. Yeah. I haven't answered all your questions, but I'll continue to think about them, and hopefully we can keep up the conversation. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk, Professor. It was very interesting. I had a question about the anti-Islamic polemics that you mentioned, and I wondered, were these published widely and publicly, and did he claim authorship, and was he at risk of being held to account for blasphemy or any such charge? Were there any such restrictions, or would his connections to the Safavid monarchy or house have immunized him from any prosecution in that regard?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So, I mean, remember that the way it circulates is as a manuscript, right? So, and it's a manuscript which he deposits in Lahore for it to be read by people. So it's not something which he keeps secret with the intention that no one should know about it, and so on and so forth. Now, how does this exactly work, right? So there's two aspects of it, right? One is that we must bear in mind that he's not a Muslim. And insofar as he's not a Muslim, in a way, fact that he's saying certain anti-Muslim things is more acceptable than, for example, were it to be a Muslim. I mean, you know, this is the basic, as we know, Salman Rushdie problem. The problem is that Salman Rushdie was a Muslim also, right? So there is that aspect of it. And then secondly, does seem to be the aspect that he obviously has a certain degree of confidence in how well connected and well inserted he is, even in the networks in Iran, because he doesn't, hesitate to come back through the same route. So, so the two things, I think, I mean, because, now you could say that the Mughal court is a different space from Safavid Iran, but in the Mughal court, I mean, we have records of debates between Muslims and Christians in the court. And in those debates, some quite nasty things get said, for example, about the miracles of the Prophet and things of that kind. But they get said in public in the court, and that's that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. You got to the question that puzzled me in your lecture, and that was what the reason for the pathological carrying of his wife's carcass, might I say, for up to 5 years. Why did he do it? Does anyone know? You said it wasn't, you don't buy the theory that there was something in the Shiite.
No.
But
no, I mean, because there is a whole, production then of the funeral. The text printed for the funeral, the frieze on the tomb, right? The poems that get written by his poet friends, of which some are allegedly in the Turkish style, so, very sort of orientalizing as well, right? So, yeah, so it's there is a kind of sense that we have of him as this extremely sort of, shall we say, self-dramatizing figure also, right? And he wishes to affirm this, and his love for this woman, and et cetera, and it's very, yeah. So there is a certain, to use the famous expression that Greenblatt gave us, a kind of a particular self-fashioning going on over here, right?
Okay, we have a question from our virtual audience. This focus, Subbatial. Thanks for your fascinating talk, Professor Subrahmanyam. Of course. Thank you for your fascinating talk, Professor Subrahmanyam. Is there any evidence that this that his interlocutors in Lar and are Sunni intellectuals who supply the polemics against Shias, given that Lar has historically had a larger Sunni population?
I think the question is, and I'm going to paraphrase it, do we have any evidence of debate in Lars with Sunnis? Because there were more Sunnis than Shias in Lars. So do we have any evidence for that in the archives? Is that what the question was? It sounded like that to me.
I'll be happy to repeat. So he says, is there any evidence that his interlocutors in Lar and Sunni, intellectuals who supply the polemics against Shias, given that Lar has historically had a larger Sunni population?
Historically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, were they Sunnis?
Yeah. Right. So it is true that Lar, if we take it back to the 15th century, and so on, was also an important center. But I mean, what I am unclear about is the extent to which, for example, the Safavids in the course of the 16th century, when they pretty much did a cleansing of Sunnis from a lot of Iran, right? Actually did so in Fars as well. So the question would be whether by the time he was there in the 1620s, 1610, 1620s, that important group of Sunnis still survived in a place like that. Certainly, if you take it back, yes, but I would tend to suspect that probably they would not have survived in the same numbers. And one reason for it is, of course, we know that there's a huge number of migrants into India in the 16th and 17th century who have the Nisba Lari, which means that these were all people who were fleeing Iran at that time. Right? So, but it is worth a second look to see whether there were still surviving, knots of a Sunni presence in Lar. Yeah.
So I think this is all we have, or that's all we have time for. We are going to have one final question.
I can phrase it as a comment, which maybe we can develop. And, there's that famous saying, follow the money. And so, we hear about him as a patrician, but he is carrying out, this long, complicated, expensive set. So I find myself fascinated about the money, both the financing of the travels, but also about whether what he's bringing back does accrue in terms of prestige. Yes, it's clear he wants the patrician image, all of that to happen, but is there actually material benefits we are seeing?
Yes, it's an interesting question, but I actually don't think that one can see a particular case like his in those terms. I mean, even if you, by the way, I'm sorry to appear a bit pathological myself, but the other thing which he does when he's in Egypt, he buys mummies, by the way, which he has shipped back. So fortunately, he doesn't carry those, through the desert the other way. He ships them back from Alexandria to Italy. So there's maybe one can see a pattern developing.
I just had a small question myself about this nature of this very fascinating archive and the connections that you made between them. And clearly the networks that he has are very divergent, right? So, and they're sort of interesting. I just to think about the Safavid manuscripts. So is there any reference of texts which you could then sort of follow in a sense, and manuscripts where, did he have any debates? I know that you talked to this one manuscript in Lar, but might there be any materials in Persian, in that world of which he was a part of, clearly a significant period, right, and where he came back? So I was just wondering if, because this material seems to be from the Vatican archives and sort of great, and it's really fascinating about the connections between the two. But I'm just wondering if there is another piece, or as the earlier author who you referred to, he said the Safavid archive has disappeared and we have to rely on the writings of the European travelers and their fascinating.
Yeah, actually, the point which John Gurney, who you're referring to, made, still remains more or less valid, which is that actually, if you make the comparison between the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals, the Safavids actually are the ones who don't have an archive, right? So we don't actually more or less have archival documents. You have surviving manuscripts, which are usually manuscripts of texts, right? Which include, of course, chronicles. And if you actually look at the way in which Safavid history gets written even today, the way it gets written is by combining the big chronicles, which are really like the official chronicles, with then the European materials. And, for example, what has happened to us in Mughal India, for instance, is that whereas, let's say, 100 years ago, someone who was writing Mughal history might have been quite dependent on European travelers. I mean, today we've sort of not pushed them away entirely, but we've relegated them to a quite secondary place, right? And for example, the Ottomans have done so even more, right? Because they have actually a massive archive, right? Whereas I think in the case of Iran, the European accounts still maintain a much more sizable place, precisely because of this interesting imbalance, and which is what makes it all the more necessary to rethink who these travelers are and what it is that they're telling, and why it is they're telling us what it is they're telling us.
Okay, I think this is all we have time for here. So thank you very much. And until the second lecture.
That concludes tonight's lecture. Thank you all for being here and for listening to Professor Subrahmanyam and asking those interesting questions. What a curious person to know from the 1600s. I'd like to also take this opportunity to tell you about more UC Endowed Lectures. We will resume our series next term with the R.K. Tietzel lecture that will be given by Professor Deanna Bowen in the Fine Arts Department at Concordia University. Her title has yet to be announced, but it will be held Wednesday, September 17th in this room at the same time. We'll also be having the S.J. Stubbs lecture. It will be given by Professor Emily Wilson, College of Women class of 1963 term, professor in the humanities, chair of the Department of Classical Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and her talk will be on Tuesday, October 7th, again in this room. Check back with our website to get more details about the titles of those talks. I'm sure they'll be interesting. These UC Endowed Lectures are fantastic opportunities to hear from world-class scholars about the things they are most passionate about, and they have certainly uncovered some very strange characters in our midst and in the past that we can learn a lot from. I always come away from these lectures having learned something that I did not know before, and I'm sure you have too. I'd like to extend special thanks to Associate Professor Malabika Kasturi, convener and moderator tonight. Tomorrow it will be Associate Professor Janita Sharma, who will be convening and moderating. Bonnie Wong over there is running the technology. Thank you, Bonnie. We have graduate students from history being here as well, and all other students, staff, and faculty that have been involved in the orchestration of these very complicated visits. So thank you to them too. And Sanjay, thank you for your inspiring talk. I'm fascinated by the character we were introduced to tonight. He's a little eclectic and pathological, to use your word. Best part of the night. For those of you here in person, around the corner you will find a wonderful reception laid out for you. I invite you to join us and break bread together over a glass of wine. And I wish you a great evening. I will see you tomorrow.